Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Mikael, and this is what I learned today. As the United States' upcoming elections comes closer on November 5th, I wanted to talk about how people can make small choices that go against their own interests. So today we're going to discuss something difficult but important. How regular German citizens came to support Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. Many people believe Hitler took power by force alone, but the reality is much more complex and more troubling. But before we can understand why so many Germans rallied behind Hitler, we need to examine the desperate state of Germany before he came to power. After World War I, Germany was left broken. The Treaty of Versailles placed full blame for the war on Germany, forcing it to pay crippling reparations to Allied powers. This devastated the economy. Ordinary Germans saw their savings disappear almost overnight as the country's currency, the mark, lost its value. In the early 1920s, Germany experienced one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in history. Imagine this: a loaf of bread that cost just 1 mark in 1918, suddenly costing millions of marks by 1923. People carried their money in wheelbarrows, only to find out by the time they could spend it, it wasn't worth anything. Families couldn't afford basic necessities, and many were left hungry and homeless. I'm going to quote Else Wendell, a social worker at the time. People were starving. Children were malnourished. I saw families selling everything they had just to buy food. The inflation destroyed any sense of stability. End quote. Even as inflation slowed in the late 1920s, Germany's economy didn't have a chance to recover before the global financial system collapsed again during the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 sent shockwaves through Germany. Millions lost their jobs almost overnight. By 1932, nearly 6 million Germans, about 1 in 3, were unemployed. The situation was serious, and with businesses failing, poverty rose sharply. To make matters worse, the political system was chaotic. The Weimar Republic, which governed Germany at the time, was weak, constantly changing leaders and unable to unite the country. The political parties were divided, and this left many Germans feeling hopeless, turning to more extreme solutions. It was during this time that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party began to rise. Hitler used this economic depression to his advantage. He promised to restore Germany to its former greatness, blaming the country's trouble on the Treaty of Versailles, communists, and Jews. His message offered hope to people who felt abandoned by their government and humiliated by Germany's defeat in World War I. For people suffering through economic collapse and national humiliation, Hitler's promises were hard to resist. Quoting Else Wendell, the social worker previously mentioned, and I quote, "We wanted to believe in something, anything that could make our lives better. Hitler seemed to have the answers." End quote. But the consequences of those promises were terrible. As Hitler gained more support, he began to implement policies that benefited certain Germans at the expense of others. Blaming minorities for the country's problems, it became easier for many Germans to overlook what was happening to their Jewish neighbors, especially when their own lives were improving. This is how ordinary people, worn down by fears and suffering economic hardship, found themselves supporting a regime that would soon commit some of the worst atrocities in human history. Then, Hitler's government started making changes. They created jobs, building roads and factories. Young men who had been unemployed were now earning money again. The government gave loans to new couples married to help them start families. They built new houses and schools. To begin to understand how powerful these changes felt, Let's listen to what Elsa Wendel, a social worker in Berlin, saw during the time. And I quote, "People who had been begging on the streets were suddenly working again. Families who couldn't feed their children now had food on the table. Many Germans started to believe that Hitler was some kind of miracle worker." End quote. But it wasn't just about money. After losing World War I, many Germans felt humiliated. Their country had lost important territories. Other nations looked down on them. Hitler promised to make Germany strong and respected again. He rebuilt the German military, even though this was forbidden by international treaties. Instead of feeling ashamed, many Germans started feeling proud of their country again. This economic recovery and renewed national pride came with a terrible price. Hitler blamed Germany's problems on Jewish people and other minorities. As conditions improved for many Germans, they found it easier to ignore what was happening to their Jewish neighbors. Some even started believing Hitler's lies about them. William Hubener was a teenager during this time, and this is what he remembered, and I quote, "When you saw your father working again, your mother able to buy food again, it was easy to believe everything else Hitler said. We didn't want to question where this prosperity came from or who was paying the price for it." End quote. One of the most powerful ways Hitler kept control was through young people. The Hitler Youth wasn't just a club, it was a way to create loyal followers. Young people were taught to put Hitler before everything else, even their own families. But as the war progressed, some Germans began to see the terrible truth behind Hitler's promises. One of the most powerful stories comes from Traudl Junger, who worked as Hitler's secretary during the final years of the war. Her story shows us how ordinary people slowly woke up to the horror of what they had supported. And I quote, "I was 22 years old when I became Hitler's secretary. I thought I was at the center of something great. We all did. But later, I realized I had been part of something terrible. The worst part was understanding that I could have known earlier. The information was there, but we chose not to see it." End quote. Axel von Dombursche, who served as an officer on the Eastern Front, later revealed how knowledge of the mass killings spread. And I quote, "People knew, maybe not everything, but they knew enough. They saw their Jewish neighbors disappear, they saw the trains, they smelled the smoke from the camps, but they told themselves it couldn't be what they feared, or they said, what can we do? It was easier to look away." End quote. By 1944, as German cities burned under Allied bombings and millions had died, many Germans finally began to question their support. Henrietta von Scharch, one of Hitler's oldest associates, tells us about the moment she confronted Hitler about the deportation of Jews she had witnessed in Amsterdam. And I quote, "When I told Hitler what I had seen, he became angry. He said I was being too sentimental. He said that while thousands of German soldiers were dying every day, the Jews had to be eliminated. And that's when I finally understood. There was no greater good. There was no noble cause. It was just pure evil." End quote. After the war, Traudl Junger dedicated her life to speaking with young people. Her message was powerful, and I quote, "I tell this story to young people because I want them to understand how easy it is to become part of something terrible while thinking you're doing the right thing. When you're young, you think you know everything. You think you can judge what is right and wrong. But I tell them, if you find yourself in a system where speaking up means risking your life, it's already too late. You have to recognize the warning signs early. You have to speak up before the system becomes too strong." End quote. Gunther Threadwit, who was just a schoolboy in Dusseldorf during the war, put it this way, and I quote, "People ask how we let it happen, but that's the wrong question. The right question is, how do you make sure you would recognize it happening today? Because it never starts with concentration camps. It starts with small choices, choosing comfort over consciousness, security over morality, us over them. End quote. So, before we end today's episode, I just want to review some takeaways of these powerful testimonies. So, economic desperation made people vulnerable to extreme solutions. When Hitler appeared to fix Germany's economic problems, people were willing to overlook his darker actions. Support for the regime wasn't mainly based on fear. By 1936, around 90% of Germans supported Nazi government because they believed it was improving their lives. The Nazi regime gained power gradually through small compromises the people made, choosing personal comfort over moral concerns. Most Germans knew about the persecution of Jews and other minorities, but chose to look away, showing not wanting to know can make us complicit in terrible events. And by the time many people realized the full horror of what they had supported, the system was too powerful to resist, teaching us we must recognize and resist extremism in its early stages. Like I said earlier, guys, I thought this was interesting as the upcoming elections come in the United States and the choices that we need to make. Remember, it never always starts with concentration camps. It starts with the small choices we make in our political ideologies and our political choices. I hope you learned something today. I thought this was super interesting, how people don't know the choices they're making have terrible consequences, and I wanted to focus on the people of Germany to express this. I hope you learned something. I did. Thank you, and have a good one. Bye.